Imagine the shock of a French explorer hearing a Basque phrase, meaning, "the priests are better," shouted by an indigenous person on the distant shores of Newfoundland. According to one account, when Jacques Cartier landed in 1534, some native people greeted him with words they had learned from earlier European visitors. Not only that, they ended up telling him of red-haired men from the ocean who arrived generations prior. This intriguing anecdote hints at a tantalizing possibility. Intrepid Basque mariners from Europe's Iberian Peninsula may have quietly sailed to the New World before Christopher Columbus. It's a theory that paints a picture of secret voyages across the Atlantic, well before 1492, by a seafaring people famous for their skill and their discretion. The Basques, an insular European people straddling what is now northern Spain and southwestern France, have a long history as master mariners. By the Middle Ages, Basque sailors were renowned whalers and fishermen, ranging far beyond their home in the Bay of Biscay. Their ships hunted whales along the European coasts and later ventured into the North Atlantic in pursuit of cod and more whale pods. In fact, Basques pioneered commercial whaling as early as the 13th century and became experts in preserving fish with salt, establishing a thriving trade in salted cod by 1000 AD. This maritime expertise set the stage for the idea that Basque sailors might have reached North America on their own initiative. According to the Basque before Columbus theory, these fishermen had both the means and motive to sail across the Atlantic well before Columbus. The motive was codfish, and lots of it. In the 1400s, fish was a dietary staple in Europe, and sources of cod were like gold mines. Church and cultural practices amongst Catholic Europeans dictated the consumption of fish on many days throughout the year. Further, fish was a relatively cheap and healthy source of protein in a time when terrestrial forms of meat weren't generally consumed daily by most people. The Basques, along with other Atlantic seafarers, were feeling the pinch as traditional fishing grounds became either overfished or restricted by competition. For instance, the Hanseatic League had monopolized Iceland's cod trade in the 1470s, effectively locking out Basque sailors. The idea goes that Basque crews, faced with dwindling catches at home, pushed ever westward in search of new, rich fishing grounds. Under this theory, they found them in the waters of Newfoundland and Labrador. Crucially, they supposedly kept this discovery secret to protect their competitive advantage. In essence, they found the greatest fishing hole in the world, and they weren't about to tell the world about what exactly they found. After all, this cod fishery would have been the richest source of fish ever discovered by Europeans up until that point. It's a compelling narrative. Basque mariners slipping silently across the ocean, quietly exploiting the New World's bounty, and saying nothing to rival kingdoms. Indeed, Basques were known for keeping their cards close. Their unique language, euskera, isolated them culturally, and historically, they haven't been chatty with outsiders. In this theory, the Basques' famed discretion served them well. They salted their cod on hidden coasts and rendered whale oil in secluded coves, all out of sight of the competition, including the Portuguese, the English, and the French. Proponents of the Basque pre-Columbian theory point to several intriguing clues, though none is conclusive. These pieces of the puzzle suggest that Basques could have made it to America before 1492, even if definitive proof remains elusive. English customs records indicate that Basque traders delivered unusually large shipments of beaver pelts to England between 1380 and 1433. What's odd is that by the 14th century, beavers were nearing extinction in the areas of Europe that the Basques had access to. Yet despite this, the Basques were importing bundles of pelts, rolled in the distinctive style of eastern Canada's indigenous peoples. Some historians have speculated that these pelts came from the New World, having been obtained as a result of trading with the native population of eastern Canada. If true, it implies Basque contact with North America a full century before Columbus. This theory is speculative, but it's exactly the kind of subtle footprint secretive fishermen might leave. Notably, this theory seems to me to be relatively easy to either prove or disprove. If we can find and test beaver-based objects from prior to 1492 and prove those were made of American beavers, this would, in essence, prove the Basque theory. To my knowledge, this hasn't been done, and I don't believe it's even been proposed. But if you know otherwise, let me know in the comments below. The Basques weren't the only ones seeking new fisheries westward. The Portuguese and English merchants were sniffing around too in the 15th century. Portuguese records speak of a land of codfish west of the Azores region in 1473. The aggressive policies of the Hanseatic League with respect to codfish off Iceland didn't just hit Basque fishermen. English adventurers from Bristol, cut off from Iceland's cod, funded voyages in the 1480s to find cod to the west of Ireland, and are believed to have returned with suspiciously abundant catches. Under this theory, both the Portuguese and the English suspected the Basques of finding cod far to the west, and attempted to find these sources themselves. Perhaps the most colorful evidence of early Basque presence is linguistic. By the early 16th century, when French and English explorers began formally charting eastern Canada, they encountered signs that Basques had preceded them. Not only did Jacques Cartier perhaps hear a Basque greeting from natives in 1534, but it's documented that a Basque indigenous pidgin language developed for trade soon thereafter. This Algonquian Basque pidgin allowed native groups and Basque whalers to communicate for commerce. It contains Basque loanwords for items like iron and bread, indicating significant contact. Additionally, Basque words crept into the languages of Atlantic Canada's peoples, and indigenous words entered Basque vocabularies. For instance, in the Mi'kmaq language, traditional indigenous shoes are called mocon, while Western-style shoes are called zapatak, which they received through Basque influence. All of this, however, dates from the 1500s, after Columbus. So at best it shows Basques were among the earliest post-Columbian visitors. However, it's not entirely clear if they were there before, especially since the entire timeline regarding the Basque arrival in the New World is quite murky. All these clues build a circumstantial case that Basques could have reached America first and kept it quiet. The scenario is entirely plausible. The Basques had ocean-going ships, expertise in long-distance navigation, and economic incentive to find new fisheries. Unlike glory-seeking explorers, fishermen had no reason to plant flags or write memoirs. Their fortune lay in nobody else knowing where they got those fabulous fish and whale oils. It's a romantic picture of humble fishermen outwitting captains sailing under the authority of kings. But before we get carried away, we should look at what we know the Basques actually did in the New World, and how that lines up with, or contradicts, the pre-Columbian theory. What is beyond doubt is that the Basques were among the first Europeans to exploit North America after Columbus. In the decades following 1492, they appear on the historical stage of the New World in a big way, so much so that it sometimes surprised other explorers. In 1497, just 5 years after Columbus's maiden voyage, the Italian John Cabot, sailing for England, reached Newfoundland. He discovered numerous Basque fishing vessels harvesting cod, having done so under the radar until this meeting. At the time, of course, Cabot had no incentive to ask these Basque fishermen how long they had been there. He was, after all, commissioned to make discoveries in the New World, and finding other Europeans in an area he quote-unquote discovered for Europe wasn't a good look. Further, when Jacques Cartier discovered the Gulf of St. Lawrence for Europeans in 1535, he noted that Basque whalers were already there in droves. In other words, the Basques wasted no time in capitalizing on the New World once the age of exploration began, and they weren't sharing their secrets. Throughout the 1500s, Basque mariners effectively turned coastal Newfoundland, Labrador, and the Gulf of St. Lawrence into their seasonal domain. Spanish and French Basque companies ran a seasonal transatlantic commute. Every summer, thousands of Basque fishermen and whalers crossed the ocean to North America, and by winter they sailed back with ships laden with salted cod and barrels of whale oil. This was arguably the first large-scale industry in North America, predating any permanent European settlement. Further, archaeological evidence has indicated significant presence of whaling stations in eastern Canada in the 16th century. Despite the enticing theory and circumstantial hints, the modern historical consensus is that there is no solid proof the Basques reached the Americas before Columbus. Mainstream scholars categorize the Basque discovery idea as an interesting but unproven hypothesis. No Basque maps have been found that predate 1492 that definitively show the New World in any way. That isn't to say that they didn't exist in some form at some time, but they don't exist at present, weakening this theory. Further, decades of digs in Atlantic Canada have uncovered Basque camps and shipwrecks from the 16th century, but nothing that can be dated to the 1400s. All the Basque sites reliably date from after 1500, which poses an evidentiary problem for the theory. Now, that isn't to say that they weren't there prior to 1500, since we know that they were there by at least 1497. However, the hard physical evidence hasn't yet been found, especially for anything pre-Columbian. Notably, for Columbus's 1492 voyage, he used many Basque crew members, given that they were known to be some of the finest sailors in Europe. Scholars point out that this transatlantic experience could have meant that Basque sailors soon after launched their own fishing expeditions. In light of these points, historians conclude that the Basque pre-Columbian voyage remains unproven. It's certainly possible some Basque ships made it to the New World, but as yet, that definitive proof has never been found. Thus, the modern consensus for the time being is that the Basques reached North America very soon after Columbus, but likely not before him. And ultimately, even if it is discovered that the Basques were in America earlier than thought, this doesn't meaningfully rewrite history. It would likely be considered very similar to the Norse settlement, in that it would be an interesting footnote or precursor to the mass settlement of the New World that would follow Columbus. Imagine Edinburgh Castle on a cold November evening in 1440. Inside the Great Hall, a lavish banquet is underway. 10-year-old King James II sits at the head of the table, flanked by two teenage guests, the Douglas brothers, heirs of Scotland's most powerful noble family. Laughter and music fill the stone chamber until a servant presents a grisly centerpiece, the severed head of a black bull. Before the night is over, both Douglas heirs are beheaded in the castle yard, victims of a sensational act of betrayal that became known to history as the Black Dinner. It's a scene so dramatic and cruel that it sounds like fiction, yet it is all too real. Indeed, this medieval Scottish atrocity even helped inspire the infamous Red Wedding scene in Game of Thrones. To understand why two noble youths were brutally slain at a royal dinner, we must set the stage in mid-15th century Scotland, a time of political turmoil and power struggles. 3 years earlier, in 1437, Scotland's King James I had been assassinated, leaving his son James II to inherit the throne at the tender age of 6. With a child king, the country fell under regency, and various factions of nobles vied for control of the government. One of the most formidable figures was Archibald Douglas, 5th Earl of Douglas, the head of the mighty Black Douglas dynasty. Archibald was not only the kingdom's wealthiest magnate, but was even next in line to the throne, after little James II, thanks to intermarriages between the Douglases and the royal Stuart line. His influence was so great that he effectively served as regent for the boy king, until Archibald's sudden death from illness in 1439. Archibald Douglas's demise unleashed a fierce struggle for power. On one side was the widowed Queen Mother, Joan Beaufort, determined to protect her son's interests. On the other side were ambitious noblemen like Sir William Crichton, the Lord Chancellor of Scotland, and Sir Alexander Livingston of Callander. These two men controlled key strongholds in Scotland and significant estates. Caught in the middle was the Douglas clan itself. Archibald's title and vast estates, virtually a principality within Scotland, passed to his teenage son William, the 6th Earl of Douglas, who was about 15 or 16 when he inherited in 1439. This youth suddenly became the most powerful noble in Scotland, at least on paper. But his very prominence made him a potential threat in the eyes of Crichton and Livingston. The two regents had no intention of letting the Douglas power overshadow their own grip on the kingdom. In fact, the Douglas family's influence was so extensive that many considered it a direct threat, not just to rival nobles, but even to the crown's authority. Through 1439 and 1440, the tension mounted significantly, and Crichton and Livingston jockeyed for dominance. They even went so far as to seize the young King James in a bid to control royal legitimacy. In essence, they agreed to keep him under their direct control, and most importantly, control access to who he was able to see and interact with. This not only allowed them to issue edicts in the king's name, but also raised the likelihood that Crichton and Livingston would remain close advisors of the king into his majority. Basically, they wanted to make themselves indispensable to King James in his minority, so that they would continue to influence him throughout his much longer majority. At the same time, they sought ways to neutralize the Douglas factor. The teenage Earl of Douglas, inexperienced, and next in succession to the throne after James II, was an obvious wild card in the political equation. Some sources suggest that by late 1440, the king's keepers had decided that the Douglas heir needed to be eliminated to secure their own power. Thus was born the diabolical plot that culminated in the Black Dinner. In November 1440, under the guise of reconciliation and friendship, William Douglas and his younger brother David received a royal invitation. They were asked to come to Edinburgh Castle to dine with King James II, who was by then 10 years old. The invitation likely seemed safe enough. After all, dining with the king implied royal hospitality and protection. The Douglas boys arrived accompanied by their advisor, Sir Malcolm Fleming, and perhaps a small retinue, expecting an evening of feasting and diplomacy. Unbeknownst to them, their hosts had other plans. The banquet began ordinarily, with tables laden and music playing. Accounts vary on the details, but legend has it that as the meal progressed, a dramatic and chilling signal was given. A covered platter was brought forth and placed before the Douglas brothers. When the lid was lifted, it revealed the head of a black bull, a dire omen that, in medieval Scotland, signified death. In that instant, the atmosphere flipped from merriment to terror. This was the cue for armed men, loyal to Chancellor Crichton, to burst into the hall and seize the young nobles. King James was present at the dinner according to later chronicles, and by some accounts he watched in horror as his guests, who were also his cousins, were grabbed by soldiers. One version of the story even claims the boy king begged for the lives of the Douglas brothers, protesting that violating the sacred guest right was evil and dishonorable. But if James pleaded, his guardians ignored him. The Douglas brothers were hauled out of the hall and down to Castle Hill, where a sham trial for treason awaited. Outside, under whatever pale moonlight November offered, an impromptu tribunal accused William and David Douglas of plotting against the crown. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, given that William Douglas was 16 and had shown no active rebellion at that point, and his younger brother was literally a kid. Nonetheless, the outcome was preordained, and in a matter of moments, the boys were declared guilty of treason. The appalled 10-year-old king could only look on as his guests were butchered under his nominal authority. The Black Dinner's horror lies not only in its brutality, but in the utter betrayal of trust it represented. In medieval culture, to slay invited guests under your roof was a crime heinous enough to bring divine curse upon a host. The incident flagrantly violated the code of hospitality and also of kinship, since they were the king's relatives. If the event is taken at face value, the crown's regents had hoped to cripple the Douglas clan by eliminating its young leaders. Then their plan didn't have the neat outcome they expected. And trust me, I'm going to get into that in a moment, because there's ample evidence to suggest that the Black Dinner was somehow far more sinister than it appears. In fact, if anything, it demonstrated how precarious Crichton and Livingston's control really was. News of the disturbing act spread quickly, and many members of the Douglas faction reacted with the appropriate fury given the circumstances. And you may notice that I said many members here, because someone very important, who is about to be introduced, didn't seem too broken up by the whole event. For the time being, though, the enraged portion of Douglas supporters retaliated by laying siege to Edinburgh Castle. Sir William Crichton, who they believed orchestrated the banquet and was holed up in the castle, suddenly found himself under assault by forces loyal to the family. Realizing his vulnerable position, Crichton surrendered the castle to the Douglas faction forces. Rather than being punished for his role, however, Crichton managed to escape retribution and even kept royal favor. He handed Edinburgh Castle directly over to the young king and was later formally rewarded with a title for giving up his castle, or at least, that was the official story at the time. This medieval Scottish mystery is about to take a very hard turn into deeply conspiratorial territory. With the 6th Earl and his brother dead, the Douglas titles and estates passed to their great-uncle, James Douglas, Earl of Avondale. He was a chunky, middle-aged man, ominously nicknamed James the Gross. Tellingly, despite his 2 young great-nephews having been brutally slain, James the Gross showed no intention of avenging them. This inaction raised eyebrows in this violent age. It was customary for Scottish kin to seek vengeance for such slayings, yet James the Gross did nothing. It almost seemed a little bit too convenient, since he would have never inherited these titles otherwise. The Douglas family as an institution continued to dominate the royal court and government offices, filling them with Douglas relatives and allies. When King James II finally came of age in 1449 and began ruling in his own right, he discovered that the Douglas clan still had a stranglehold on the kingdom. The Black Dinner had removed 2 Douglas boys, but it hadn't eliminated the family's influence. Curiously, it seemed to have the exact opposite effect, and the family only seemed to grow in power under the authority of the 7th Earl of Douglas, James the Gross. How very curious indeed. Over the next decade, James II struggled to assert his authority against the entrenched might of the Douglases. The bitterness of the 1440 betrayal lingered in living memory. Eventually, in 1452, King James took his own revenge in an eerie echo of the Black Dinner. He invited William Douglas, 8th Earl of Douglas, the son of James the Gross, to Stirling Castle under a promise of safe conduct, then personally gutted him. This was a far cry from the boy king, who may have cried and tried to save his cousins by appealing to the rules of hospitality and the prohibitions against kinslaying. The 8th Earl of Douglas was, after all, both his guest and his kin. From the moment the Douglas boys were slain, one burning question has persisted. Who was truly behind the Black Dinner's heinous plot? The event had all the hallmarks of a carefully planned ambush rather than a spontaneous act. Yet the exact identity of its architect has been cloaked in some mystery, inviting debate among historians. At the time, popular opinion and later chronicles often blamed Sir William Crichton, the Chancellor, as the primary culprit. It was Crichton who controlled Edinburgh Castle and whose men physically carried out the arrests and executions. However, Crichton was not necessarily acting alone. Notably, Sir Alexander Livingston of Callander, who shared power with Crichton during the king's minority, is often mentioned as an accomplice. Livingston was deeply involved in the Regency's power plays, and some sources list both Crichton and Livingston as co-conspirators who together orchestrated this dark dinner theater. The reasoning is that both men feared the Douglas influence and theoretically collaborated to break the Douglas clan's power by decapitating its leadership both literally and figuratively. And that was the official version of the story that was accepted at the time. However, in the warm light of day, centuries afterwards, professional and amateur historians began to question this narrative. Beyond the royal advisors, intriguingly, suspicion also falls on a member of the Douglas clan itself. Modern historians increasingly view James the Gross, the victim's great-uncle who inherited the earldom, as a key beneficiary and perhaps the silent mastermind of the Black Dinner. At first glance, it sounds counterintuitive. Why would a Douglas betray his own kin in such a horrific manner? Well, if you've played Crusader Kings, you may have been able to intuitively figure out the answer to this already. James the Gross was an older cadet of the family with comparatively modest holdings, until his young great-nephew came along as Earl. If his great-nephews died without heirs, James stood to gain the entire Douglas inheritance instantly, and that is exactly what happened. By removing the two boys, James the Gross became 7th Earl, suddenly in possession of the vast Douglas possessions. Notably, in the wake of the Black Dinner, James not only took over the Douglas estates, but also aligned politically with Crichton. Modern scholars find the case against James the Gross compelling. They point out the telling detail that after becoming Earl, James never sought vengeance for William and David, an unusual omission in that era of Scottish feuds. His failure to prosecute or punish Crichton looks highly suspicious at the very least. Further, it makes virtually no sense strategically why Crichton would want to slay the two inexperienced brothers, knowing that their vast lands would fall to James the Gross. James the Gross had already proven himself to be a capable and dangerous man, unlike the two brothers. If Crichton had really wanted to diminish the power of the Douglas clan, it's argued that he would have only taken out the 16-year-old, leaving the much younger brother in charge. For reasons that make no sense strategically, he simply chose to remove both brothers, handing full control of this powerful clan to a capable rival. Crichton was heavily embroiled in late medieval power politics, and had proven himself to be very effective at advancing his own position. It seems unlikely that such a formidable man could make such a great oversight, especially given the conduct of James the Gross afterwards. Notably, contemporaries don't seem to have suspected James the Gross as being involved whatsoever, which strikes me as unusual. To put it in language that'll be familiar to all my Crusader Kings 3 players out there, it seems to me that James the Gross must have had a ridiculously high intrigue stat. Though I suppose perhaps not quite high enough, since James the Gross was one successful scheme away from becoming James III of Scotland, but of the House of Douglas, not Stuart. The Black Dinner of 1440 remains one of Scotland's most infamous betrayals, a night when dinner guests became victims and a royal castle became the scene of an atrocity. Its legacy has all the elements of a dark legend. Innocent young nobles, scheming lords, a duplicitous feast, and a violation of the ancient laws of hospitality. The mystery of who conceived this deed will likely continue to fascinate historians for generations. However, today, the prevailing view is that it was a conspiracy of interested parties. Most believe that Chancellor Crichton, Regent Livingston, and James the Gross all had their hands in the plot. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click like and subscribe and to share this video with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership to support my channel further. It's London in 1665 and the Great Plague is raging, but even beyond the plague's terrifying toll, the weekly bills of mortality list other, more enigmatic causes of death. One entry in particular catches the eye with its almost poetic name, Rising of the Lights. It sounds like a mystical event, yet for people of the 17th and 18th centuries, this phrase was grimly real. It was not a metaphor or spiritual ascent, but a literal cause of death frequently recorded in parish registers and mortality bills. What on earth did Rising of the Lights mean? And what do modern scholars think these unfortunate sufferers actually died from? To understand the Rising of the Lights, we must step into the streets of early modern London. In those days, death was a constant visitor, and city officials kept track of it through weekly publications known as Bills of Mortality. These bills listed how many people died in each parish and the cause of each death. A special group of people called searchers went around and compiled what they thought that each person had died from. The searchers had no medical training, and they were often older women who examined the corpses and reported what they observed or what family members told them. The results were fascinating and often macabre. Alongside familiar terms like plague, smallpox, or consumption, one finds very curious labels. Notably, most of these weird labels are fully understood now by cross-referencing with other documents outside of the Bills of Mortality. Of these, only the Rising of the Lights remains a complete unknown, with some theories attempting to explain what it is, but no definitive proof. Notably, Rising of the Lights was among the more common of these old post-mortem diagnoses, which simply adds to the mystery. In the plague year of 1665, for example, London's annual bill recorded hundreds of deaths by Rising of the Lights. The phrase itself is likely, though not certainly, rooted in archaic language. Lights was a Middle English word for the lungs. So, if this etymology is accepted as factual, Rising of the Lights literally meant the rising of the lungs. I do need to emphasize, though, that while this may be a very likely theory, it isn't a certainty at all. However, this is the best we've got on the literal meaning of the term lights in the context, so most of the subsequent analysis will be predicated on the assumption that this is accurate. This language undoubtedly puzzled people even at the time, since it was a Middle English phrase used in the era of early modern and modern English. In essence, it would have essentially been the equivalent of using a long out-of-use word from the Victorian era to describe something more modern. But it's more confusing than that, because the word wouldn't be out of general usage, but rather would have continued on in other contexts, creating even more confusion. The name hints at what the searchers observed: signs of respiratory distress. In essence, some believe it may have been a 17th and 18th century catch-all term for any death associated with serious breathing trouble. If someone died gasping for air with a heaving chest and coughing, a searcher might shrug and record the cause as rising of the lights. It was a way to describe a horrible final struggle for breath, as if the person's lungs were obstructed or even rising up in the throat. Contemporary descriptions suggest what the symptoms looked like. One later source notes that doctors of the era said only common folk used the term, and that it was apparently only used to describe situations where it was fatal. In other words, the victim likely suffered a severe bout of choking or suffocation from within. We can imagine the scene: a patient wheezing and clutching their chest or throat, their voice reduced to a hoarse bark. Lacking modern terminology, observers resorted to vivid metaphor. The lungs, the lights, seemed to rise up and cut off the breath. It's a haunting image, and it left a strong enough impression to earn a permanent line in the mortality rolls. At this point, you may be wondering, what actual illness were these people dying from? Over the centuries, medical historians and scholars have combed through these old records to translate archaic diagnoses into modern terms. The consensus is that rising of the lights corresponds to a respiratory condition, most likely what we now call croup. Croup is an infection of the larynx and trachea that leads to swelling in a child's airway, causing labored breathing and a distinctive barking cough. It often strikes infants and young children, and without modern treatments, it can indeed be fatal. However, the term was broadly applied by people without medical training who perhaps had never seen someone actually pass from the rising of the lights in person. In the end, we simply don't know for sure what it meant, or if it even meant one thing at all. Searchers didn't have any medical training whatsoever, and the bills of mortality simply reported what they said. Further yet, the term has never been used by physicians in any capacity, and since it was only recorded as a cause of death, we have no records of legitimate physicians treating it. In the summer of 1829, the people of Osaka witnessed a grim spectacle that seemed torn from the history books. 6 condemned souls, 3 men and 3 women, were paraded through the bustling city streets. Some of them were already dead, their corpses preserved in salt for the occasion. In a final act of punishment, authorities bound each victim to a cross and methodically pierced them with spears. One male prisoner writhed in agony as the spikes struck. A woman named Toyota Mitsugi, the lone surviving female, reportedly laughed as the first spear was driven through her body, maintaining an eerie composure. This dramatic mass execution, complete with crucifixions in the heart of a major city, sent shockwaves through late Edo period Japan and left onlookers horrified. What heinous acts had these people committed to warrant such an extraordinary punishment, normally reserved for the worst traitors? To answer that, we must unravel the strange tale of the 1827 Osaka incident. This is a tale of secret rituals, sorcery, and the shadow of Christianity in a land where the faith had been banned for nearly 2 centuries. For over 200 years before this incident, Japan's Tokugawa shogunate had outlawed Christianity. Ever since the early 17th century, when Catholic missionaries and converts were persecuted and expelled, open practice of the Christian faith had vanished from the country. The authorities took pride in the idea that Christianity had been eradicated by the 1640s after brutal campaigns of suppression. By the 18th and early 19th century, the official stance was that there simply were no Christians left. at least none foolish enough to announce themselves. Christians were remembered in popular culture only as vanquished rebels and sorcerers from a bygone era. Plays, folk tales, and cheaply printed chapbooks portrayed Christians as cunning sorcerers and subversives who had once threatened to undermine Japan's social order. And trust me when I say it, the version of Christianity presented doesn't bear any resemblance to any of the concepts you're familiar with. For one, it's unlikely that you see Jesus as a sinister, rebellious wizard sent to Earth to destroy the Japanese social order, though perhaps your interpretations differ from mine. In these lurid stories, the Christians, called Kirishitan in Japanese, were depicted as villainous magicians. They were agents of foreigners who performed black magic and plotted to overthrow the country. By 1827, no one in Japan had ever met a native Japanese Christian, at least not that they knew of. Real Christians in Japan were, of course, not sorcerers, but a highly persecuted minority who practiced their faith in secret, trying to stay under the radar. Yet despite this, the specter of Christianity still haunted the ruling elite's nightmares. The belief that Christians had secretly infiltrated all levels of the Japanese samurai government was common. These supposedly sinister Christians were believed to be internally promoting the idea that all people were inherently equal. This completely undermined the social order, directly from the top, because it said that the emperor wasn't divine. Perhaps more importantly, it also meant that the shogun, ruling in the emperor's place for all temporal and non-ritualistic matters, wasn't wielding delegated divine authority. But all this fear wasn't entirely unwarranted or self-interested. Representatives of Christianity had actually threatened the Japanese social order in the past, with the Jesuits playing various roles of questionable legitimacy in the late Sengoku period. Even with no open church, the Tokugawa state kept up certain precautions. In many domains, authorities continued the practice of fumi-e, the ritual of trampling images, well into the 19th century. Those whose ancestors had once been Christian, or who fell under suspicion, were forced to step upon bronze images of Jesus or Mary. This supposedly proved that they had no allegiance to these figures. Refusal or hesitation to defile these sacred images was taken as evidence of Christian belief. According to scholars, real believers would supposedly recoil from desecrating Christ's likeness, thereby revealing themselves. This was based on the mistaken belief that Christians believed that a life essence of Jesus Christ or Mary were in these images. Interestingly, this fumi process ended up having the exact opposite effect that was intended, even though it did end up drawing out Christians. Japanese hidden Christians wished to participate in this process since it was the only time they could safely view images of Jesus and Mary out in the open. In general, the clandestine believers had adapted their faith over generations, disguising Christian icons as Buddhist figures. Japanese Christians commonly kept figures of the Bodhisattva of mercy, known to the Japanese as Lady Canon, to represent the Virgin Mary. For Jesus, they would often keep statues of Amida, the Buddha of light and compassion. Since these were two of the most popular religious icons in Japan, this didn't raise any suspicion. Further, the propagandists in the Tokugawa government had portrayed Christians as deranged occultists, set on destroying the social order. The idea that they would keep figures representing infinite love and compassion really didn't seem comprehensible to the authorities, at least in most cases. For many Japanese Christians during this period, this supposed humiliation ritual would be the only time they would ever see proper images of Jesus and Mary. Every other time they would look at Lady Canon and the Buddha Amida and imagine, since keeping actual Christian iconography was simply too risky. Using this method, the Tokugawa authorities believed that there were no actual Christians in Japan since the 17th century. After all, even when they went to areas where people were suspected to be Christian, everyone seemed surprisingly zealous about getting out there and stepping on these images. This is why the events that began in Osaka in 1827 were so shocking. For the first time in centuries, authorities claimed to have uncovered active Christian devotees. Officials feared that everything they had read in old tales about Kirishitan sorcery and sedition was coming true again, threatening the social order in their own backyard. What they actually found, however, turned out to be far stranger and more tragic than a straightforward Christian revival. It all started with reports of odd goings-on among the urban underclass. Osaka in the late Edo period was a commercial metropolis teeming with people of all walks of life. Aside from merchants and craftsmen, the city had its share of down-and-out drifters, street preachers, and folk healers offering cures and fortunes for a fee. In early 1827, city officials caught wind of a small circle of such practitioners, mostly women, who were performing peculiar rituals and claiming to channel otherworldly powers. These women were ostensibly Inari shrine mediums. Inari, the Shinto god of rice and fox spirits, was popularly worshipped for blessings in everything from business to fertility. Mediums would go into trances and let the god's voice speak through them, dispensing advice or healing. It wasn't unusual to find Inari mediums in Osaka's neighborhoods, offering spiritual services on the fringes of religious orthodoxy. What was unusual were the whispers that some of these mediums were invoking something other than Inari. They had built a small shrine which they claimed housed a deity called Tente, meaning the Lord of Heaven. Clients seeking cures or divinations from these women heard them chant an incantation that sounded foreign to Japanese ears, a phrase rendered as Zensu Maru Haraiso. I don't speak Japanese, but apparently this phrase is essentially Western-sounding gibberish to a Japanese audience. Unbeknownst to the listeners, this was a garbled attempt at saying, Jesus Maria, Paradise. In other words, the mediums were mixing the names of Jesus Christ and Mary into their spell. Furthermore, they conducted secretive rites that included mysterious writings and rituals, all centered around a sacred image they called the Lord of Heaven. This image doesn't survive, and it's unclear if this was a depiction of God or something else entirely. The leader of this little circle was a middle-aged widow named Toyota Mitsugi. Outwardly, Mitsugi appeared to be just another fortune-teller and faith healer trying to make a living. She and her associates would perform healing prayers and exorcisms for paying customers. They operated under the convenient cover of Inari worship, which was acceptable to the public, but also considered kind of weird and unorthodox. In essence, conducting an unusual Inari ritual would just be written off as the kind of unusual thing that Inari mediums did. But behind closed doors, Mitsugi had introduced a very different kind of devotion. Those initiated into her inner circle would learn that this Lord of Heaven, the strange mantra Zensu Maru Haraiso, was in fact calling on Jesus and Mary for salvation. How on earth did an Osaka peasant woman learn about Jesus Christ in the 1820s with no missionaries around and with native Japanese Christians laying low? The answer lies with a shadowy figure named Mizuno Gunki. Gunki was already dead by 1827, but a few years prior he had been the mentor who set Mitsugi on this path. By all accounts, Mizuno Gunki was a charismatic con man turned mystic, one of those colorful characters who drifts through the fringes of respectable society. He had some education, and even connections to noble circles in Kyoto, but also a history of swindling. At some point, Gunki had a religious awakening of sorts and became obsessed with Christian teachings. Importantly, his knowledge of Christianity did not come from any secret priest or foreign source. Rather, Gunki had read about the quote, Jesus sect in Japanese books. These were likely the very same popular tales and persecution records that portrayed Christians as powerful sorcerers and Jesus as a sinister Saruman-like figure. In other words, Gunki only knew about Christianity from anti-Christian propaganda, which portrayed practitioners of the faith as literal wizards. Impressed by these stories, Gunki apparently believed that by mastering the forbidden religion, he could tap into supernatural powers. Filtered through anti-Christian propaganda, he believed he would even have the ability to resurrect the dead, and perhaps even attain eternal life himself. He spread these ideas to a small group of followers in the Osaka-Kyoto area. Mitsugi was introduced to Gunki around 1822 by a local tea house owner who knew of her spiritual ambitions. Mitsugi learned the exotic names and rituals from Gunki, and after his death in 1824, she took up the mantle of leader. It's important to note that most scholars believe neither Mitsugi nor Gunki had any apparent direct connection to the traditional hidden Christian communities. They were essentially reinventing Christianity from rumors and books, filling in gaps with their own imagination. That said, I'll be coming back to this in a moment, because there's the slim possibility that this mystery goes much deeper than one might imagine. By mid-1827, rumors of Mitsugi's unorthodox shrine and spellcasting had reached the ears of Osaka's city magistrates. An investigation was launched, led in part by a diligent samurai official named Oshio Heihachiro. Oshio and his colleague painstakingly tracked the threads of this case through both Osaka and Kyoto, uncovering a surprisingly broad network of people involved in the strange sect. What they found was a motley crew drawn from various walks of life. Mitsugi's circle included not just poor widows, but also a couple of male devotees, including a samurai and even a Shinto priest. They didn't form an underground church, but rather an association where they discussed forbidden magic they believe was granted by the Lord of Heaven himself. As the investigators interrogated these suspects, a picture of the group's practices emerged. Mitsugi and her female disciples would go into trance-like states, claiming to be possessed by Inari, but then use Christian prayers to attempt healings. They were play-acting a Japanese fantasy of Christian sorcery, hoping to harness the legendary magic of the Kirishitan for their personal benefit. And when I say their personal benefit, I'm referring to the ability to make money from their wizardry. All sources seem to suggest that they truly believed that they were tapping into a much more powerful divinity than anyone knew. This is where their practice differs from the cartoonish propaganda depictions. They appear to believe that they had acquired insanely powerful magic from God and Jesus, and they didn't see anything wrong with profiting a bit on the side in return for legitimate healings. The authorities saw no difference between this unusual form of magic and Christian practice. After all, Mitsugi's followers were behaving exactly how the Christians in Edo-era propaganda behaved. According to investigators, they weren't just trying to use foreign magic to make a quick buck. They were using their sinister magic to win over people to their subversive sect and turn them against Japanese society as a whole. Osaka's magistrates chose to treat the whole thing as a full-blown Christian conspiracy, despite the fact that no church activities had actually been uncovered. The distinction between a diluted magic cult and an actual secret church was lost in the fear that gripped the officials. The accused were subjected to intense interrogation over many months. In Edo period justice, this often meant extreme methods to extract full confessions. especially in cases of serious crimes. Detailed testimonies were compiled in which each defendant recounted their life story and involvement with Christianity. Reading these records today, one can sense both the confusion of the accused and the almost theatrical zeal of the interrogators. Mitsugi, when pressed, proudly owned up to learning Christian magic from Gunki and attempting to awe others with it. She insisted, however, that she meant no harm to the government. Her aims were personal, not political. In essence, all the members of the sect argued that they were simply practicing sorcery, which was a minor offense, not practicing Christianity, which was a capital offense. When the investigation concluded, Osaka officials urged severe punishment, and after significant debate, it was decided that everyone would be crucified. It appears the shogunate wanted to send an unmistakable message. No matter how small or strange, any form of Christianity was still a mortal crime in Japan. When authorities went to carry out the sentences in 1829, they found that time had thinned the ranks of the condemned. Of the 6, only 2 were still alive in prison, including Mitsugi, the leader of the sect. The shogunate's mandate, however, was unwavering, and even the dead would not be spared punishment. In a macabre gesture, the 4 corpses were packed in salt to preserve them. There, the authorities tied up all 6 individuals, 2 living and 4 deceased, on raised crosses for display. Executioners then dispatched the living pair by piercing them with spears, the method traditionally used for crucifixion in Japan. To complete the ritual, they also thrust spears into the lifeless bodies, as if to symbolically execute the dead all over again. The immediate impact of the incident was a wave of alarm throughout the country. The event fed into a growing anti-Christian paranoia in late Edo society. It came on the heels of those scholarly warnings about Western infiltration. The fact that they were mostly lower-class women and marginal figures only heightened official fears that the most vulnerable segments of society might be seduced by Christianity. In reality, as we've seen, Mitsugi's group had no ties to foreign agents or real missionaries. Their idea of Jesus was that of a divine, rule-breaking wizard, an extremely unorthodox idea cobbled together from anti-Christian sources. Meanwhile, the story of the Osaka incident began to take on a life of its own in popular imagination. One particularly sensational thread of rumor tied the incident to a dramatic event a decade later: Oshio Heihachiro's 1837 rebellion. Oshio, remember, had been one of the lead investigators who cracked the case in 1827. In 1837, he became disillusioned with the shogunate and led a violent uprising in Osaka in protest of officials hoarding rice during a famine. After Oshio's rebellion was crushed, some whisperers looked for supernatural explanations for how a loyal lawman turned into a treasonous rebel. They seized upon his connection to the Mitsugi case. Soon, lurid tales claimed that Oshio had been possessed by the vengeful spirit of Mitsugi, that the witch he sent to her death had cursed him and warped his mind. Other versions suggested Oshio had secretly been converted to the Kirishitan sect by Mitsugi's teachings or by her ghost. And yeah, just when you think this story has everything already, it has a ghost converting people to a super hardcore metal version of Christianity where Jesus is a powerful wizard. Under this theory, he used the black magic he learned from her to try to topple the government. Of course, none of this was true in a literal sense, but this didn't stop it from being a widely held belief at the time. With all that said, one major question still lingers about Mitsugi's sect. For the last 2 centuries, it's been speculated that perhaps they were very legitimate underground Christians, and that they were essentially playing a game of sect inception. Under this theory, they posed as Inari worshippers, pretending to follow a cartoonish version of Christianity that lined up perfectly with the propaganda. Meanwhile, they may have used this as an actual tool to spread Christianity once individuals became acclimatized to the process. This would also provide cover if they were caught, since they could claim they were practicing sorcery, not Christianity. In fact, as I had mentioned earlier, this was the defense raised by everyone in the sect. They weren't actual Christians, but rather just dabbling in an unusual form of sorcery, a crime sure, but nothing too serious by Edo standards. Notably, there's no proof that this is the case, but the idea that they were actually real hidden Christians expanding the faith in an unorthodox way has fascinated observers for centuries.